Good evening, everyone. My name is Kama Pierce, and I'm the COO from Levine Museum of the New South. And welcome to tonight's Shaping Charlotte. Tonight, we're going to be discussing a wonderful documentary called Let the People Decide and go back through the history of our voting rights here in the United States. And we're doing this with a wonderful partnership with the School of Good Citizenship. We have partnered with them in an exhibit called Counting Up What's on Your Ballot. That is online, actually on our website, but it's also in our space. So you can come now and see it live and experience some of the great work by some great artists. And we are also doing 3 programs with the School of Good Citizenship, and this is the second of those 3. The museum's actually open right now, so just quickly want to let you know that we are open on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And if you go to our website that's going across the screen right now, you can get our hours. We are encouraging people to pre-purchase their tickets because we are obviously looking at the numbers in the building and following all protocols to keep everyone safe and healthy. But the exhibit online is wonderful. It is very powerful in person to visit as well. We've also at the museum added some augmented reality to our core exhibit where you see some local leaders come and share history with you in person on screen. So we hope to see you at the museum now that we're open. And I just have to put a little plug in for a very special friend for the museums. That is Mert's Heart and Soul. It is a restaurant that is uptown on College Street. They have been very supportive of the community. They've been very supportive of the museum, and they have amazing soul food. Chicken, their lemon cake is to die for, carrot cake. And it's one of many restaurants uptown that I would love to encourage people to come out and make sure that we continue to support while we're down with COVID, because they are getting hit pretty hard. And we want to make sure that when we open up, that all of these establishments are there and greeting us because they've been so important and great in our community. So now to the program. Tonight, we are joining Dr. Willie Griffin, our resident historian, as he sits down with the director of Let the People Decide. I'm going to introduce Gavin. Now, I already told Gavin I'm going to butcher his last name. I'm from Jersey, but Guerra, I think I'm saying that incorrectly, but Gavin has given us a great piece of work with Let the People Decide, and he's done it generously to all of us in the audience. There is a link to enjoy it. So if you didn't get a chance to catch it before tonight's program, it's actually going to be open till Saturday, and I highly recommend that you grab it and enjoy and learn a lot of our important history that we're going to hear from Gavin. And I appreciate all of the research and work that he has done behind this piece. In addition to Gavin, we're going to be joined with Jinna Kim. Jinna is actually one of the very talented artists that's featured in our exhibit that's both online and in our building. She put a small documentary together that is so powerful. It's called Chinese Girl Wants to Vote. And it's so important that she tells this story because we need to know the women who were part of history and bringing us the 19th Amendment, bringing the vote. And I think it's a little known fact of the input and it wasn't just white women, it wasn't just African-American women, but we have many races that were part of that fight. And so we'll hear more about that. So I know you're tired of looking at my face, so it gives me great pleasure for me to introduce our moderator for tonight. Jonell Logan, who is an independent curator and a friend of the museum, is going to take this over. Have a great discussion, Jonell.
Thank you, Kama. And thank you for that fabulous introduction. We are really excited about this conversation because, one, I think it embodies the relationship and the partnership between the School of Good Citizenship, who organized the What's on Your Ballot exhibition and has been doing work in Charlotte around the idea of voting and voting rights, and also civic engagement, and the Levine, which is so centered in history, but is often looking for different ways to explore and talk about the history that we all share. So this is really a dynamic, I think, conversation. We have 2 amazing filmmakers who will be a part of the process. And then Willie also providing some great history for us to really kind of consider and putting a lot of what I think we sometimes think as historical context into a contemporary framework, because as we were talking about right before we got on screen, a lot of the issues that we see today, we have seen 10 years ago, 50 years ago, and hopefully we will not see them in the future. But this is really an ongoing conversation. And so I am just going to ask Willie, Jinna, and Gavin to join us on screen. I think it's super important for people to introduce themselves, right? I don't want to speak for anyone. So Jinna, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Hi, my name is Jinna Kim. I do live in Charlotte, and I do have a day job working at a bank. But in terms of my background, I became a filmmaker during quarantine. I do have a interdisciplinary arts background. I've been trained classically, and so really excited to be part of this conversation. So what I want to encourage is I'm here, living proof. You can add to the history. You can learn how to make films. You can be active. So again, thanks for including me.
Thank you. And Gavin, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. My name is Gavin Guerra. I directed and produced and did most of the work. I'll let the people decide. I too am a first-time filmmaker, though I have 30 years experience in post-production. So I am what is known as a visual effects supervisor. So whenever you see dinosaurs running down the street in a movie like that, I'm the guy in charge of that kind of stuff, right? Although I also teach quite a bit at the university level, filmmaking and visual effects as well. But, you know, I was always like an amateur historian. And so this film, you know, the opportunity to make this film presented itself to me. But because I work mostly in commercial work, I honestly thought that this would be like a 6-month project, and it was 6.5 years to make this movie. So there's that. But anyway, it's a great honor to be here, and I'm really glad to engage with North Carolinians in particular, because North Carolina plays such a big role in the film. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing this like kind of project, this epic project with us. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Willie, you are last but not least, because we are actually going to start the conversation. So please share who you are.
Oh, well, I'm Willie Griffin, a proud Charlotte native, staff historian of the Levine Museum of the New South. I've been in this position for about 2 years now. I'm a little over 2 years now, actually 2.5. I've been in love with history since high school, and have always been fascinated with local history. And so in my research, my sort of doctoral level research at what I completed at UNC in 2016, I looked at the civil rights movement, and I'm currently writing the local civil rights movement, and currently writing a biography of a journalist who traveled all around the South documenting the civil rights movement before the television really emerged to capture and tell the story.
Great, thank you. So really, let's kind of start with the historical context, right, around voting and some of the issues that exist around that practice, right, and that civil right. And we are in a moment where we know across parties that voting is incredibly important, especially right now. Right. And so can you talk a little bit about, there's this idea, I think if you look at social media and if you kind of listen to some of the conversations that are happening, that anyone who is a citizen can easily vote, and they should exercise their right. There is another kind of reality where that may not necessarily be true. So can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that American citizens have when trying to vote? What are some of those kind of systems that are in place, some of the challenges that make it not necessarily easy for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I mean, a great way to jump into this long history to show that voting has always been a really contentious process in this country. Even before we think about voting becoming a real issue around after the end of the Civil War and emancipation. But even before then, citizens people who considered themselves Americans were struggling to gain the right to vote. Prior to the end of the Civil War, prior to the start of the Civil War, much of the government was ruled by a slave-holding class, right? And so just here in North Carolina, I can speak from the standpoint of giving North Carolina's history, because I think it's a sort of a microcosm of the larger country. But over 85% of the government in North Carolina prior to the Civil War was controlled by slaveholders. And it wasn't, but even approaching the Civil War, there was already some disgruntled citizens. By 1850, you see white farmers beginning to push back and demand access to voting, because one of the requirements to vote is you had to own property. And so poor white farmers in the central Piedmont and the Mountain West were demanding that this ruling class begin to share some of this political power, share some of this economic development that's only happening in parts of the state. And so it was like a 6-year struggle. By 1856, you have white farmers gaining, they're removing these requirements, or free suffrage. There's this right that is granted to everyone. And then, the women had been pushing to vote even before slavery ended, and you have African Americans involved in that as well, that process. But after the Civil War, you begin to see these new tactics emerge to prevent people from voting, particularly African American men. The 13th Amendment, of course, abolished slavery, and immediately across the South, like in North Carolina, you had the creation of black codes that not only tried to help reassert control over African American life, it prevented them from being able to migrate out of the state and back into the state, being to carry weapons, but also they couldn't vote. And so this is when you begin to see the federal government institute what historians called radical Reconstruction or military Reconstruction. And you have the implementation of the 14th and 15th Amendment. And immediately in response to these legislations that are designed to give African Americans the vote, you have these other tactics that emerge to thwart voting, like Ku Klux Klan violence. They're burning down homes, they're threatening people with violence, and so forth. And by 1875, I think Gavin's documentary shows that by 1875, the South really becomes this sort of solid South. Where there's a Southern Democratic Party that really takes control over the entire South, and they're instituting this new system that helps re-enslave a lot of poor blacks and even some whites, into this system of convict labor and leasing. And they're using this, and this is when you begin to see the laws that say that felons cannot vote any longer. If you're convicted of a crime, you can no longer vote. You have, of course, poor whites and poor blacks begin to push back. They're organizing. The fusion movement emerges, and they're able to realize that blacks and whites have more in common than not, particularly along class and economic issues. And they're able to gain some political power, particularly here in North Carolina, places like Georgia, Arkansas. But there's a backlash. Again, whenever this happens, there's always a backlash when you see this progress. And so out of the fusion movement, you see this emergence of a conservative Democratic Party that is pushing a white supremacy platform. And they are using all kinds of tactics, from media propaganda to violence. And they're seeking to really disenfranchise African Americans. They're using newspaper ads, political cartoons to portray African Americans as trying to dominate politics, Negro rule, calling them rapists, and all kinds of things, just to try to create a wedge in between poor whites and blacks. And so out of this, they were triumphant, and they were able to implement literacy tests widespread across the state of North Carolina. You had the grandfather clause. The literacy test said that you had to be able to read and write in order to register to vote. The grandfather clause was exempted all males from literacy tests, particularly if they had been able to vote prior to the end of the Civil War, or they had descendants or ancestors who could vote prior to. And so that eliminated a lot of African Americans whose ancestors had been enslaved. And so there were also poll taxes that were implemented. And so this was just really effectively prevented African Americans from or discouraged them from entering the political process for another 2 decades. And by at the end of World War I, you begin seeing Black men, and particularly in North Carolina, places like Tennessee and Memphis, African Americans are beginning to experiment with politics again. Of course, the 19th Amendment is passed, and women enter the stage finally after decades-long struggle. So politics begins to pick up. And I think one of the things that is unique that you may not see in the documentary, in Gavin's documentary, is that in places like North Carolina and Tennessee, as I mentioned, African Americans are beginning to vote again, and they're organizing across the state. They're organizing what they call Negro citizens leagues, and they're encouraging the more Blacks to vote. And so by the 1960s, when you see this larger movement to hit the Deep South, that involves SNCC, that involves SCLC, that's when you see the sort of the outcome. If you watch the documentary, the 64 and 65 Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act, and this changes the landscape of the South. And there's this slow process of a political realignment. And by the 1980s, it's pretty much set in stone. You have a flipping of political parties. You have the Republican Party is now dominated by conservatives who had been Democrats prior to the turn of the 20th century. But in the 1980s, you begin to see these new tactics emerging, like gerrymandering, the propaganda using dog whistle politics. And so they're not really new tactics. It's just I guess the media delivery system is different, right? You have television that delivers it much faster than newspapers had formerly. And then up until present, right now you have these new tax voter ID laws and so forth, and trying to prevent or decrease the amount of early voting days. And so there's a number of tactics that are not new, but have just evolved.
And it's interesting that, like, you talked about the idea of like convicts, not being able to vote, and that long history. And now we're in a moment where, if we look at the news, there's an entire kind of dialogue around who's paying for the fees and whether that's like legal. And so it's this kind of interesting and unfortunate legacy that we continue to see in our politics. Now, can you do one thing for me? So I want to make sure that everyone, because we see this in the news a lot, like conversations around gerrymandering. Right. So can you define that for us so we have a framework? And can you also just kind of define the voter ID laws, like or the desire for people to have voter ID to vote?
Right. So gerrymandering is this process that states use to district or create political districts throughout the state, and they're used to either most often to provide sort of unfair advantage in the political process. Like you begin to see gerrymandering in North Carolina before the turn of the 20th century. There was what they called the Black Second, and this was the eastern part of North Carolina where the majority of African Americans lived. And so when African Americans had been able to gain the right to vote following the 14th and 15th Amendment, what you saw Democrats do is redistrict the state and make sure that those African Americans only had power in the second district. And so it would made it impossible for them to elect Republicans in any other part of the state. So it limited the number of representatives. Now, they had a lot of representatives in state politics, but it limited the number. And so you begin to see with the Voting Rights Act of 65, you begin to see that these efforts to redistrict, it allowed for states to create these minority majority districts. And as a way to provide African Americans, those people who had been denied access to vote, more power. So in North Carolina, you have the creation, I believe, of the second precinct, and then the 12th district, so forth. So I think, and the second district starts at the northern edge of North Carolina, of Charlotte, and cuts this small sliver of a line all the way up to Durham and the Raleigh area. So it's called the Black Beltway. But the gerrymandering is just a way that politicians try to rezone the political districts throughout the state, either to dilute the political power of a district that may be heavily concentrated for Democrats, or concentrate those parties so that they don't have political power in a sort of adjoining district. So I think that's really important. I mean, gerrymandering, you hear it all the time, but it really reemerged in North Carolina politics in the 1990s, I believe, to become a really important issue.
Thank you. And just real quick, 30-second, like the ID, voter ID, like why, the question of why are people so resistant to this idea?
William Barber talks about the reality that we've never had voter ID laws. And so there's this belief that voter ID laws help prevent in-person fraud, right? And I think one of the statistics that they quoted in the documentary was that in the investigations, there had only been 30 cases of voter ID fraud out of millions and millions of ballots that had been casted. So why this became an issue, according to those folks of representative in North Carolina during the Moral Mondays movement, was that it tried to make voting more difficult for some African Americans and other people who were poor, who didn't have access to voter IDs. And so a lot of people don't understand what goes into getting a proper ID to vote. There are a lot of there's a lot of red tape. You may have to purchase, if you're older, you may have to purchase a birth certificate that could cost you money. You may have to travel to a certain place within the state to get those things done. And so there's traveling costs. And so the point of, I think, of that Reverend Barber was trying to make is that these laws there's never been a voting ID law in the state of North Carolina. And why is it necessary now? And so I think that what researchers have found is that they were, and even what the Supreme Court decided, was that these laws were done to make voting difficult, to prevent certain people, certain populations from voting.
Thank you. And thank you for laying that kind of great foundation for us to work from. This is going to be a conversation. We'll talk individually, but I really, would love for you all to check in with each other and kind of jump in now that we have this great kind of level to work from. So what I want to do, Gavin, we're going to talk about your video in a moment, but we're going to play a little clip, the intro,
It's considered one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed.
What the court did today is say it's outdated.
It was a total unawareness of the existence of prejudice in the United States.
We'd worked so hard, we'd struggled so long, people had lost their lives for this, and bam, it's taken away just like that.
We are sick and tired of being sick and tired.
If we're going to do anything that's worthwhile, we've got to go for the vote.
That's a revolutionary act in Mississippi.
They didn't like integration, they didn't like the vote, they didn't like niggas.
The voting was absolutely dangerous business.
That was the big fear of white folks, to vote.
They were fighting for their dear life, their way of life.
We are going to see to it that law and order is maintained, and maintained Mississippi style.
You could go missing, and no one would ever find you.
Republican was a synonym for Yankee. Republicans were the party of Lincoln.
As black voters were flocking in increasing numbers to the Democratic Party, white voters would flock in increasing numbers to the Republican Party.
Parties switched places.
They recognized that they could use race to win.
That's commonly called playing the race card.
Don't play the
race card.
A new bill has been introduced in the North Carolina Senate requiring North Carolinians to present an ID when they go to vote.
These are not dumb Southerners wanting to get those black people.
It has nothing to do with race.
Of course it's race. How can you say it's anything else?
We have marched, we have lobbied, we have advocated, we've gone to the hearings. We said, no, we have to go to the next level.
You think we're going to allow any group of politicians to suppress the right to vote? You must be out of your doggone mind.
Mr. Trump has again repeated the unproven claim that millions of illegal votes were cast in the last election.
None of them come to me. They would all be for the other side.
Where is the evidence of that? The President of the United States is correct 100%.
There's nothing to do with voter fraud. Nothing to do with voter fraud.
Do we have to fight these battles all over again?
So, Gavin, how does a guy who makes dinosaurs kind of run across your screen end up making a film about voting rights?
Well, I'll keep it short, but it started with a book that I picked up to read on an airplane. Pulitzer Prize winning book by a man who's in the film, was in that trailer, named Taylor Branch, called Parting the Waters. And that is the first of a trilogy on the civil rights movement that kind of made my head explode, because I didn't know so much of this, right? I mean, as a kid growing up in the 70s, which is not that far removed from the civil rights movement, it was very much distilled to Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, the March on Washington, and then on to Vietnam. I mean, there really wasn't a lot there. I knew a lot of the characters as their later in life personas, like John Lewis was a congressman, Marion Barry was a mayor, Andrew Young was an ambassador and a mayor, but I didn't know where they got their start. I didn't know how they cut their teeth in this movement. And so many other people who I just never heard of. The chief of them was Bob Moses, who struck me as enigmatic and eminently interesting, because he was the antithesis of what the stereotype of a civil rights leader is, right? He's not an orator. He doesn't get up and give speeches that are inspiring and you go, do your thing. Very quiet, very intellectual, very cerebral. He's very methodical and about getting the work done. And his whole story that was laid out in the book and sort of bringing the voting rights movement into Mississippi was so fascinating to me. And I kept trying to get my friends who make documentaries to do it, to make this movie about him. And they kept politely turning me down, but not for any reason other than they had their own projects to work on. And what you don't know if you don't make documentaries is that it's kind of an all-encompassing thing. It sort of takes over your life. So if you're working on a project and someone comes to you with another idea, you just like, yeah, you take it somewhere else, right? So I put it away. I didn't give it much thought until I lived in Astoria, Queens, New York City for many years. And there's this wonderful museum there called the Museum of the Moving Image, which is about, the moving image, television, film, what have you. They had an event where they got together several of the cast members from Roots, the miniseries, the Alex Haley miniseries on slavery. And I went and attended that, and Ben Vereen and LeVar Burton and Leslie Uggams and Lou Gossett Jr. were on stage. And this was in the winter of 2013, and Obama had just been sworn in for his second term. And I guess, certainly in liberal bubbles, there was this air of post-racialism, like it was this kind of strange feeling like, oh, well, that chapter is done. We can move on to something else. And these guys were having none of that, right? These actors were reminding us of what they went through just as actors, right? Never mind as just, normal people, who don't make a lot of money, but that just the struggles that they went through in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And they went out of their way to say to the audience that was very middle class, NPR, PBS-y, audience members, museum goers, if you will. They said, look, if you think that this race thing is done, you're kind of deluding yourself. And then they challenged the audience right there. And I really felt strangely like they were talking to me. Like I was in a room full of people, but I felt strangely isolated. And they said, what are you doing? to make the world more equitable and socially just today? And I didn't really have an answer, you know? So I turned to my friend who I attended the thing with. I said, I'm going to make this movie about Bob Moses. To which he replied, who's Bob Moses? Right? And I was like, well, there you go, right? So that was the impetus. I mean, this film was born out of that moment, right? Having said that, the film that you watched is not the film I set out to make. I mean, in a 6.5 year journey, it evolved quite a bit, right? So those of you who've seen the film, you know, it's really Mississippi is Act 1 and is a proxy for the civil rights movement. So I didn't chase down every act of aggression or voting rights struggle in the civil rights movement. I used Mississippi to sort of tell that story of that time. And much like Willie said about North Carolina, I use North Carolina as a proxy for the country today, right? I didn't go to Indiana or Wisconsin or Alabama or you know, or Texas, like Florida. I could have gone all over the place, Georgia, but I really wanted to focus on, because they're all kind of the same story, right? It's just more of the same. So I really tried to bookend it as much as I could with Reverend Barber and the NAACP today and Bob Moses and SNCC then, and then connect the dots between those movements to kind of show, as you were saying in the intro, the historical context of how we got to where we are, because we often have these discussions without them, but there's no context to it. People say things like, if you ever went down a rabbit hole online, right, and just got into like some stranger that you're arguing with for no reason other than to kill 6 hours of your life, I don't know, and they'll say things like, you know, the Democrats are the party of the Ku Klux Klan, and you go, well, yeah, man, that's absolutely true, but you know, and there's like a big but there that we're not talking about, right? The Republicans are the party of Lincoln. Like you hear this all the time, and you're like, you're absolutely right, but you're just spewing facts with no context, right? So let's discuss how we got to where we are, because where we are now is, unfortunately, the Republican Party is branded as the white supremacy party today, right? And they have a guy at the top of the ticket who makes no apologies about it. And as much as they would like it to be otherwise, that's where we are. So how did we get here, right? And my film, I hope, does an adequate job of sort of connecting those dots and getting us from the open racism of you know, Jim Crow to the more subversive, plausible deniability racism of today, right? And how the language shifted and all that kind of stuff. And so I really I felt that was the necessary tack to take. Was it occurred to me at some point in the making of the film that this really wasn't a story about 1964. It was a story about today, and I feel like we can have that discussion. And really, the language that is being used today would not be unfamiliar to the people in 1964. I think they would be perfectly at home listening to this stuff and going, "Yeah, that's about right." You know, it's.
And can you? Actually, what I want to do is to set you and Jinna up to connect a little bit, right? Because we're all here together, and you both are kind of filmmakers, not even kind of, are filmmakers. And so, and Jinna, we're going to close out the program showing your video. So can you, is there anything that Gavin talked about that is similar or connected to your experience in making your film?
Sure. In terms of, well, it's different because I definitely felt a calling to do something now more than ever. And what I'll do is I'll start with my personal story, and you can see how it differs pretty greatly from Gavin's, but here we are today, lucky to intersect. Mm-hmm. So my personal story was I actually didn't pick the Asian suffragists. And this is a story that the Levine Museum doesn't know because I don't really share it, because right now it's public. So I want to tell you, you know, like kind of where it landed. So you're hearing where it's going to land. The reason why it's going to be shown at the end is because it's less than 5 minutes, and it will have a life beyond this. It's been uploaded to digital North Carolina. So actually, a local North Carolinian theater was looking for an Asian American suffragist to celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment ratification, because someone else had told this theater director, what about the perspectives that are not Black and white? For example, did you know the Immigration and Naturalization Act is also in 1965? However, the person they had already picked was Mabel Lee, who I had never heard of, even though I grew up primarily in the United States. I am a naturalized U.S. citizen, but I moved here when I was 3, so my entire schooling has been here, and I just got used to not seeing all the different, perspectives. And there's only so much time in the day to teach so many different subjects. And so what I did was I tried to stick very closely to the history, and I did an original adaptation of compilations of her words. But what actually happened was, I'm Korean American. They replaced me with my Chinese understudy and cut me out. That's what really happened. So is that racism? Is that microaggression? Is it bigotry? I'm going to say it's none of the above, because it's kind of transcended that. And the reason for is, so I had the script. This is the original script. Is actually in the film. Nothing has changed except for the narration. But I wasn't confident. I'd never been a filmmaker. So I did a anonymous peer review through another local organization, Dramatists Guild. And actually, by accident, my anonymous peer reviewer left her email on the front page. You're not supposed to do that. And I'm not going to reveal who it is, but it was someone who I thought was more accomplished, who was actually a Black female. So I was like, if a Black female thinks this is good enough to get produced, let's just see. And then, I was like, well, I don't have the experience. I don't have funding. Let me see how many volunteers I can get. So it's a truly quarantine film. All the actors, I was the director, the producer, the writer. My friends composed the music. My editor is a Black man because I was ghosted by other people, because ideally I wanted to work with women. I wanted to work with, people of color, but I couldn't find like a woman editor. So that's kind of how it came to be. But what's also interesting is I did not really envision it, even though it was about Mabel Lee. It wasn't supposed to have as many Asian faces, because the question of authenticity keeps coming back to me, because I'm actually Korean, even though I'm Asian American, and I'm not Chinese. And if you look at the history, it's different. And that's, even today, like, who knows the different timelines of every single, Asian American? And so I just want to share that, everyone's story, it's authentic, it's important. And also what my film does, it does celebrate Asian American participation in the suffrage movement, but also you will see a diversity of faces represented in the film. So I really see it as it's not only celebrating, my timeline was to get it done within May. I didn't know May was Asian Pacific Heritage Month, so I had just a Zoom viewing. Because when I grow up, like, I just learned that there was Immigration Month, and I didn't even know that, and I'm an immigrant. So, it's like all those things. So I'm not really judging what's right or wrong, but I do want to say that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Whatever you do, whether you participate in a film, whether you vote, participate in the census, learn your history, it is all valid.
And it's interesting that both of you, it's like a passion project, right? So like, this isn't something.
It's like negative money. The amount of time you spent. You said 6 years. I was like,
I got.
You won't tell anybody.
Holy moly. Really, every now and then she'll bring it up. She'll be like, that could be our new kitchen that you just spent. I'm like,
oh wait, how many volunteer hours? You're like, hundreds? Thousands for you, Gavin? Tens of thousands of hours? People don't, it has to be passion, because who else,
But I think
this?
6 years, right?
Right? Like, in this moment, like this conversation and this level of commitment to telling these different stories, is so important. And I'm curious, like, what is something that has come out of this process for you? Like, something that you learned or something that you didn't expect to happen has happened as a part of this process for you?
You want to go, Jinna, or should I go? I'll go. It's a lot, actually. I mean, it's you can't work on something as hard and as long and as dedicated as this without learning something about yourself and learning something about actually other people too, right? I mean, it's funny, right? And so first and foremost about me, as I learned I could do this, right? Like Jinna said, it's you can do it. You can do it. You just got it. Ain't nothing to it but to do it, right? Now, nothing gets done by yourself. You do need, it's a team effort. I have 30 years in post-production, so I built up a lot of goodwill, and I called in a lot of favors for some really talented people to step up and make me look good, right? From the color correction to the music to the audio balancing to all that stuff that I know not, well, I know some about, a little bit about everything, but you know, you want to, you know what your strengths are, and you know what you're not good, and you know where you need help, right? So the thing is, you can only do that so many times before they stop taking your calls, right? You have that goodwill.
I was going to interrupt you.
Gavin's calling again. I think I'm busy, you know, do my hair. So what you try to do is you try to find like-minded people who understand what this means, right? If this is important enough to get done, it's important enough to get done right. And so, and then of course there are people who let you down, and so you learn something about people that way as well, right? And so it reveals a lot of character issues about people. But more than that, I mean, I felt honored in a very strong way to engage with history at the level that I was able to do so, right? I mean, to sit down and have a 3-hour conversation with Dick Gregory is well, no one's going to be able to do that ever again, right? I mean, or Julian Bond or John Lewis or these people, it's there's nothing like hearing it from their lips, right? I mean, you can read it in a book and go, wow, that's amazing, but to sit down and have a real discussion with these people and get, like I was talking about earlier, to get that context, right? To in what way did this come about, and what did it mean? And Bob Moses is an awful interview subject. Because he tells 30-minute stories, right? And I need like 30 seconds. Like I can't, like, how do I take what he gave me and make it fit, you know? But you learn so much talking to him, right? I mean, it's like he will get there, but he's going to get there his own way. Whereas someone like Julian Bond speaks very concisely because he was the communications director for SNCC and he knows how to talk to a camera. Reverend Barber is a genius at talking to the camera. Everything out of his mouth was usable, right? So you learn a lot about the craft, but I really feel like there was this aha moment for me, well, like I had said early on, when this became a then and now story, like when it became less about Bob Moses and more about the historical arc of voter suppression, that meant a lot to me to sort of connect those. Like once it connected in my head, I knew that I had a narrative that was different than, say, a Stanley Nelson movie who made the Freedom Summer doc for PBS, right? No one had made a movie like this before that covered these 60 years the way that I did. And I felt that that was pretty important for me. It gave me something to hang my hat on in a way that I wasn't just making another, you know, movie that told the Freedom Summer, Schwerner Goodman and Cheney story. It was about more than that. And so that helped me quite a bit.
I'll be short and sweet. Pretty much me and Gavin are like almost the same, except on a smaller scale, like a slice of that. So I learned a lot, not only about myself and how I've grown, but others. And it's one thing, and I don't know if it's like if you're a person of color or you have a different background and you ask someone for help. And what's interesting is I usually don't ask for help, so I didn't know. I'm still shocked, like people who you know, ghost you, you know, right? Like, or they start helping at the beginning and they're like, okay, I've had enough. And I, you know, and so does that make me petty? I'm like, what, you're going on vacation? You're not going to like redo your whatever, like, you know, for the price of free, for social justice, you know? So,
Gina, I had a run off with $10,000. I paid him up front, right? And he just didn't do the work. You know what I mean? And, you know, what do? You know what I mean? It's like you expect
And
people
see
to
where
live
you've
up to their
come
word.
today.
Yeah.
And so one thing is, for me personally, how it's become bigger is I'm like, I have nothing to lose, right? So I've emailed the mayor, I've emailed Dimple, I saw a CNN article, Colleen Jenkins, who was the descendant of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She watched my link. My film is short, so she literally watched it, emailed me back, and she emailed what a stunning video about the life of Dr. Mabel Lee, who was referenced in her CNN digital piece. Please keep the voice of Dr. Lee alive. And I'll end with this in terms of where is it today. So actually, Kama introduced us. So I because I had emailed, I was like, well, I'd seen all this stuff locally with the library doing Engage 2020, and people were like, great, they had watched my video. Oh, we'd like to include you, but they didn't. So I'm doing something separate. That's not the point. It was just, that's how I learned about the Digital Public Library of America. And I found out how to get this in there because similar to yours, I didn't see something quite like my piece anywhere. Not that I could find. So I look on the website and I'm like, are there any people who look like me? Maybe I didn't scroll enough because I didn't see it. So I emailed them and they're like, this is great. And but the only way to get in is through the Levine or like the library, and both of them in Charlotte. I mean, like, the film couldn't be distributed. My film couldn't be distributed in a way. Again, like, I'm not working with a budget. I'm really working on goodwill, and also just like their support. So what's great is I know going forward, people will be able to download it, view it for free. It's not going to be like an exclusive piece. You don't have to like wait for theater to be produced live in some unknown date in the future, which is where it originally started. But yes, I still have my petty moments, but I try to keep those private. But like sometimes you're just so mad, and you realize now, like, $10,000, it still hurts, right? But like, look at you, we're presenting to, to ongoing audiences and how relevant it is today.
Yeah, no, you're right. I don't dwell on that, right? I mean, that's just one more obstacle to overcome, and it was far more positive than negative, as far as working with people, and you sort of, we can all kind of speak to that, like, you find your people. It's sort of a self-selecting audience, right? And a self-selecting crew of like-minded individuals who come together to make a difference. And that's, or at least you hope you're making a difference. You have to believe you're making a difference. Otherwise that won't, all those 3 o'clock in the morning nights, would be unbearable. But it's, I really feel like we're making a difference. So please don't disabuse me of that.
I'd just like to butt in and say that, I'm very appreciative of hearing you both talk about this, because I think that you all are doing history. And doing history, in the process of doing history, you learn a lot about yourself. It's the same with things that I went through in terms of trying to write a dissertation or writing a master's thesis. You learn a lot about yourself. And Jinna, I so appreciate that your comment about everyone's stories matter. But I think that the really important thing is that you're placing these two stories in conversation with each other. They matter when they stand on their own, but they matter even more when you place them in conversation with other stories. And I think that's really what has been missing. So I'm very appreciative, and it's inspiring to hear you talk about doing documentaries. Is something that hopefully I could try to do one day. I don't know if I have the courage listening to you both, but it's something that I definitely would love to do.
Well, maybe you all can work together.
So Willie,
I have to share.
Well, Gavin, what you do matters, and Willie, in terms of like, and I shared this when I was doing like a teen filmmaking seminar. So my first tripod was a garbage can, and I say it's a steel garbage can, and I used from Aldi, like they had like the GPS suction holder for your phone, and I've used that for a long time. Right now, this light is on a tripod, and I filmed. So what I didn't mention is, I'm also an actress, and I've been booked over 100 times. I've done big productions, small productions. I'm an inventor. Like, I have a patent, so I have an MBA. Doesn't matter what my credentials are. But you know what? For my film, and when I'm in a pinch, I go to my garbage can. I put that suction cup because I know what height it is, and I just move. So in terms of budgets, what I want to encourage in my filmmaking seminar, you lose nothing by trying. And by you participating, that takes courage. And if no one sees you, you just get a little embarrassed. Move on.
I'll tell you real quickly how I got started, right? That first step is really important, right? I mean, like, there's nothing like that first step, because you can talk about making a film forever, right? And it could just be something you talk about doing. But that first step after I was at that Roots thing was, okay, what do I do? Like, how do I make this happen, right? And so a buddy of mine's dad was a famous actor named Eli Wallach from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And, he was a big time guy more in the 60s and 50s, but he was good friends with Harry Belafonte. Harry Belafonte, I learned from that book, was Martin Luther King's de facto bail bondsman. So every time there would be mass arrests, he would raise all the money, right, from all of his friends and bring the money down south and bail everybody out. So I knew he knew Bob Moses. So I got a meeting with Harry Belafonte, and I said, after just talking to him for a couple hours, can you introduce me to Bob? Because I'm just a middle-aged white guy going to knock on his door, say, hey, I want to, Bob didn't talk to white people for about 2 years. Like, literally, he just cut white people out of his life for 2 years, And here I am, I'm going to knock on his door and say, hey, I want to make a movie about you. So I called Taylor Branch, and Taylor Branch said, I will help you if Bob says it's okay, because he wasn't going to go against Bob. Nobody wants to have a movie made about them if they're not involved. Make a long story longer, Harry agreed and then didn't help me, right? And not because he was being mean. We just like our wires kept getting crossed. Then the seminal moment in the film and in life of this film was the Shelby versus Holder case, right? That gutting of the of the Voting Rights Act, and I kind of started freaking out. I felt that the narrative was getting away from me, right? That the voting rights stuff was taking off, and I was kind of stuck in neutral. So Bob, currently is he founded this thing. He got a MacArthur Genius Grant, and he founded something called the Algebra Project. Right. And the Algebra Project is a grassroots math kind of learning course where students basically say the teachers aren't going to help us, we're going to help ourselves type thing. I sent an email to him and to his assistant just off their website. His email bounced back. His assistant's email went through. And I kind of, So I looked him up. I called. I got his assistant on the phone. I said, yeah, I'm Gavin, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to make this movie. I just sent you email 2 minutes ago. Bob's email bounced back. Can you put me in touch with him? He said, you know what? Why don't you just pitch me and I'll ask Bob and, we'll see how it goes. So I said, okay, this is my movie. I want to make blah, blah, this, that, and the other thing. And I want to talk about this and I want to talk about that. He says, okay. He hangs up. 5 minutes later, he calls back. He goes, okay, Bob's in. I'm like, that was it? Really? Yeah. That was it. And no pun intended, and this is part of the lore of Bob Moses, right? Is that in the pantheon of the civil rights movement, at such a degree that as soon as he signed on, getting John Lewis and Julian Bond and all these guys to line up to talk to me was like that, right? Because he had blessed me, it all fell into place, right? But honestly, if I didn't make that phone call, I might still be trying to get Harry Belafonte on the phone to try to get him, him to introduce me, right? Wow. But you gotta sometimes you just gotta take that step. You go, you know what, I gotta do for myself here because I'm too dependent on other people and I'm just begging for favors and nothing's happening. Right. And I made that call and that set everything in motion. So that first step is huge. It's huge.
So I have to share. So the opposite happened to me when I and let me share. And it ended up in a good way. Oh, go ahead.
So 1 second. You're definitely going to share. But Gavin, I'm watching the time.
Yeah, I got 5 minutes. I got a bolt. So.
Get ready to go. Gavin is actually on another panel around the film. So I just wanted to make sure that you had a time check and.
Well, if there's if you have one more question I can answer, I'm happy to answer it. So is there anything else that we want to talk? Does anybody have a question for me?
Questions for Gavin? So why don't we say this, Gavin, are you open to people like you reached out to folks? Are you open to people reaching out to you to talk to
the little people? I don't talk to the little people.
Oh, well.
Is it possible?
Of course, yeah, I'm more than happy to have people reach out to me. I mean, that's silly. Definitely. If anybody, you guys have my contact information. Feel free to reach out with any questions, or if you want me to come back, I'm happy to come back. So
I'll definitely reach out to you, Gavin.
I think it's a great honor for you guys to show my film, and I'm really happy that you're helping get the word out about voting and the importance and history of voting rights. And so I hope everybody got something out of it. And like they said, it's going to be available for another few days. So those of you who are tuning into this discussion but didn't get around to watching the film yet, I'm leaving it up there. Watch it and let me know what you think. You can leave comments on the Vimeo page too. So, okay.
Great. Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you.
Have a great night.
Thanks, Jinna.
Yes.
Bye, Jonell.
Bye. So, Jinna, I know I said that you could continue your answer, and I do want you to know, because it can lead us into showing your film. But the only thing I want to ask, Willie, just quickly, I loved your kind of connection and reach out to Jinna and to Gavin because I think it's so important when we think about how we tell stories, and you talked about this, right? The story of history, that there's so many ways to do this. And so it's just kind of wonderful to have this opportunity to really think about how can we creatively tell the stories, build out our sense of history, but then also like make these connections. So, you know, we might have a Willie Griffin documentary coming out soon.
In the works, yeah. And I'm thinking, I've been thinking of, okay, I'm going to reach out to you as well, Jinna. I know we're now connected on Facebook, so yeah.
Yeah, the YouTube videos we had to watch to, edit.
No, but yeah, I think that's really important. History is not something that only historians do, professionally trained historians. I think that we all have our stories to tell. And as Gavin said, he started off as a sort of a novice historian. Mm-hmm. And I think that, all you got to do is the history is out there, read it. It's everywhere now. How information is disseminated now gives you so many tools at your fingertips to add to the stories that you try to tell, whether you're writing, whether you're filming, or just telling stories in person. I think that's really important.
Thank you. So Jinna, why don't you share with us and then kind of lead us into your video that will take us out tonight?
Sure. Let me segue with what Willie's saying. History is not in the past. History continues to be in the making, right? So vote, participate in the census. If you're going to complain, or just like if you don't participate, then it could mean that money doesn't go towards your demographic. Charlotte's demographics have been changing, right? Or, if you're feeling not happy, make a film, sing a song. There's many different ways you can participate. It's okay to laugh. We can have some hard jokes. It's you can reconcile and get over it. My main message is participate. Participate in the way that you feel comfortable. Your story, your voice matters. And to kind of lead into my film, it became more inspirational because I did get the feedback that I wasn't authentic because I'm a Korean telling a Chinese American suffragist story. And the example that was given to me was from one of my best friends from graduate school, who said, Jinna, it's like Morgan Freeman narrating the story of Mabel Lee. I'm okay with him narrating it, but he cannot be the face of Mabel Lee. I'm like, of course not. He's playing, and I had a lot of criticism, which is how my film came to be. I decided to make it more inspirational, as open as possible, to have different age ranges, but also by voiceover. I will be giving a talk through the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library on Monday through Engage 2020 with Dr. Min Jang, who is a local UNC professor, who is also a naturalized US citizen who's Chinese American. And so we it's important to just listen to the different voices, whether or not you feel it's authentic or not. The important is you keep an open mind. I didn't love the feedback at first, but look at where the film has become. So it has influenced it, and hopefully it'll encourage you to continue to participate, whether or not it's the quarantine, whether or not you have a budget.
So I'm just really thankful for this conversation, and really this opportunity to think about and talk about some of these contemporary issues that are really contentious, right, to engage in. And I love this whole idea of just do it, and two, right, when doing it, do it in a way that is authentic to you. So Jinna, thank you. Willie, thank you. Gavin, thank you. And Jinna, we are going to lead out now with your film. Yay! So, yay! Everyone have a great night and enjoy.
Bye. Thank you, Jonell.
Thank you.
She most certainly suffered unjust rejection galore. I don't know her at all. She seems really fascinating and I'd like to know more.
Who was the face behind Chinese Girl Wants Vote? From the National Park Service. Dr. Mabel Pinghua Li was born in China and lived from 1896 to 1966. After immigrating to the United States, when she was just 16 years old, Mabel Li was a known figure in New York's suffrage movement. When New York City suffragists held a parade in 1912 to advocate for women's voting rights, Mabel Li on horseback helped lead the parade from its start. In 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women throughout the U.S. the right to vote, but Chinese women like Mabel Li could not vote until 1943. This was because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, a federal law that was in place before she was born. The Chinese Exclusion Act limited Chinese immigration and prevented them from becoming citizens. Here are some of Mabel's words from her writings, China Submerged Half, and the Meaning of Women's Suffrage.
I plead for a wider sphere of usefulness for the long-submerged women of China. I ask for our girls to open the door to the treasury of knowledge, the same opportunities for physical development as boys, and the same rights of participation in all human activities of which they are individually capable.
The neglect and indifference to a woman's welfare in the past must be remedied. Prejudice must be removed and a healthy public sentiment created to support the progressive movements. To us girls especially, who are among the first to emerge, we follow the duties of pioneers, and, if we do our share, ours will be the honor and the glory. For no nation can ever make real and lasting progress in civilization unless its women are following close to its men, if not actually abreast with them.
It's a fact that no matter where we go, we cannot escape hearing about women's suffrage. The idea of women's suffrage at first stood for something abnormal, strange, and extraordinary, and so has finally become the word for anything ridiculous. The idea that women should ever wish to have or be anything more than their primitive mothers appears at first thought to be indeed tragic enough to be comic. But if we sit down and really think it over, throwing aside all sentimentalism, we find that it is nothing more than a wider application of our ideas of justice and equality.
We all believe in the idea of democracy. Women's suffrage is the application of democracy to women.
The fundamental principle of democracy is equality of opportunity.
I cannot too strongly impress the importance of suffrage for the requirement of women to contribute their share to the steady progress of our country towards prosperity and national greatness.
After graduating from Barnard College, Mabel Li got a PhD in economics at Columbia University. She was the first Chinese woman to do so. After her father died in 1924, she took over his role as director of the First Chinese Baptist Church of New York City. She later founded a Chinese community center offering vocational and English classes, a health clinic, and a kindergarten. Dr. Mabel Pinghua Li never married and devoted her life to the Chinese American community in the United States.
The fundamental principle of democracy is equality of opportunity. I cannot too strongly impress the importance of suffrage for the requirement of women to be worthy citizens and contribute their share to the steady progress of our country towards prosperity and national greatness.